After Brad lost his child, his beloved wife was murdered by the World Peace Promotion Association, an organization that wanted his power for themselves. Revenge became the only thing keeping him alive. With hatred burning inside his chest, he set out to kill their leader, Valburga Lily. But when he finally reached her residence, the only person waiting for him was a small, confused child. Lily was no longer the terrifying leader people spoke of. She stood there in a child's body, staring at him. Everything began a few days earlier, in the adventure city of Nidberg, near the coastline and close to the forest. There was a slaughterhouse where adventurers brought their hunted monsters to be processed. One of the workers there was treated terribly by those adventurers. They mocked him, disrespected him, and forced him to work overtime like he was less than human. That man was Brad. He looked dull, worn down, and constantly gloomy. To the adventurers, he was nothing more than a weak F-rank laborer they could push around. The only person who ever tried to defend him was his co-worker, Jamaberry. Even then, Jamaberry could not do much. He was only an F-rank himself. Inside the workshop, Jamaberry nervously checked on Brad's condition. Brad showed no reaction to how the adventurers treated him. He simply kept working. Jamaberry then mentioned something he had discovered. A flyer was being spread by the World Peace Promotion Association. They were searching for someone known as the legendary mage, Bloodhound. Brad glanced at the flyer with his own name on it and gave a short, uninterested response. He went back to work as if it meant nothing. Jamaberry continued talking, saying that rumors claimed the organization's leader was personally searching for Bloodhound. No one knew why the legendary mage had suddenly disappeared. Bloodhound was once a hero. Realizing he had talked too much, Jamaberry apologized and returned to helping. The adventurers that day had brought 3 demon wolf cubs. Their small bodies were badly injured, covered in dark bruises. Brad only needed to smell them once to understand. They had been cursed. It was a slow curse, one that made its victims die in prolonged agony. Even so, he forced himself to continue the job. No matter how cruel it felt, work was still work. Night fell as they finished. Jamaberry decided to bury what remained of the demon wolf cubs, while Brad stayed behind to clean. He carefully mopped the floor and washed every cloth they had used. Then, a scream echoed from outside. Brad instantly recognized Jamaberry's voice. When he stepped out, the area was empty. Unease crept in, so he headed into the forest, following the distant noise. Soon he reached a clearing and saw the scene clearly. A massive wolf monster was tearing through the adventurers. Bodies were ripped apart. Flesh was split open. The beast howled in rage, a sound sharp enough to freeze anyone in place. Brad remained calm. He knew exactly what stood before him. That monster was the mother of the 3 demon wolf cubs from earlier. Their eyes locked. The creature's entire being was filled with uncontrollable fury. It could not be reasoned with. He noticed Jamaberry nearby, pale and frozen. Jamaberry seemed to be trying to save the same adventurers who had bullied them. 2 of those adventurers were still alive, crawling in terror with parts of their bodies torn apart. Brad hesitated. If he used magic now, the organization would surely sense it. His existence would no longer stay hidden. But the monster was about to devour everything in front of him, and he refused to disappoint someone he once cared about. Then, magic gathered in his palm. A small storm burst out from the side and struck the wolf. In a single instant, its head separated from its body. The force sent both head and corpse flying through the air, shocking Jamaberry and the 2 surviving adventurers. They stared upward at the massive head suspended for a brief second before it crashed down. The demon wolf hit the ground with a heavy thud. Its life ended in less than a heartbeat. The body collapsed right beside Jamaberry. Brad let out a quiet sigh, almost regretting his decision. Jamaberry shouted in disbelief. An A-rank monster could not be defeated in one blow. The 2 adventurers stared at Brad in horror. As far as they knew, he was only F-rank. That kind of power made no sense. Brad did not explain anything. He simply knelt beside Jamaberry and placed a hand on his injured leg. Without speaking aloud, he cast a healing spell. The deep wound closed instantly, leaving no scar behind. Then, Brad stood up, ready to leave. Despite his fear, Jamaberry tried to ask who Brad really was. Brad gave him a lazy glance. He did not want anyone digging into his past. That life was something he had already thrown away. This time, Brad truly walked off. He left Jamaberry standing there in stunned silence, surrounded by lifeless bodies, staring at the back of a man he never truly knew. The man known as Bloodhound walked toward the abandoned side of the city. Inside an empty hotel building, he climbed to the second floor and entered the room at the very end of the hall. The room was almost bare. A few pieces of furniture stood quietly in the corners. A couple of cute dolls rested near the wall. That same wall was covered in drawings of a small child. He stopped beside the nightstand and stared at a framed family photo. It was his family. Before he became the gloomy man people saw now, Brad had once been different. He had a sweet 4-year-old daughter named Fiat. He had been slightly overprotective of her. Every time she ran around and played, he worried she would trip and fall. When she cried because of a small scrape, he would panic and helplessly search for his wife. Lutz was the love of his life, a gentle woman with beautiful hair that Fiat had inherited. She would approach them with a soft laugh, amused at how flustered her husband looked. She would gently remind Fiat not to make her father worry too much. Then, the three of them would laugh together and hug, a warm and perfect picture of a happy family. Now that memory only felt painful. Brad brushed his fingers over Fiat's photo with quiet affection, then moved to the next room. He knocked before opening the door and softly said that he was home. Inside was a large bed. Lutz lay there, still alive, but connected to multiple devices and infusion tubes. She looked like a silent corpse. Yet because of the magical equipment supporting her body, she could still communicate with him through floating magical messages. Brad gave an awkward smile. Even without words, Lutz could tell something had happened just by looking at his expression. He let out a long breath. He had used his magic earlier. That meant they had to move again before they were discovered. Lutz did not get angry. Instead, she gently said she would be happy to see a different view for once. Then, she asked if their daughter would be coming with them when they moved. Brad smiled and nodded, saying he would go pick her up now. Lutz looked slightly worried because it was already dark, but Brad insisted they had to leave before dawn. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, long and tender, then helped her fall asleep before stepping out again. Brad walked alone toward a nearby church and cemetery. Just before reaching the graves, he turned and knocked on the mansion standing beside the cemetery. A priest opened the door with an irritated expression. His name was Brooke. Brad calmly explained that he had come to take his daughter and needed permission. With a sly look, Brooke demanded a donation. He claimed that permission was God's will, and the cost of that blessing was 500,000 gold. Brad instantly grabbed the priest by the collar and slammed him against the wall. The amount made his anger flare, but no matter how furious he felt, Brooke was still a priest. Brad could not completely ignore divine blessings. He released him and headed toward the city. As he walked, he kept thinking about the enormous sum of money. Around him, people suddenly began running toward the nearest tower. From the top of the tower, an announcement echoed across the city. The organization was about to hold a live broadcast. A giant magical screen appeared in the sky. Valburga Lily sat proudly on a grand chair. Beside her stood her assistant, Tarsem Fane. The citizens looked excited and cheered for their leader. Lily herself said nothing. She only stared forward, dark shadows beneath her eyes. Fane acted as the spokesperson. He declared that the legendary hero Bloodhound was an irreplaceable existence for world peace. The organization had been searching for him for half a year. If any citizen had even the smallest piece of information, they were asked to report it immediately. Fane spoke beautifully about the kingdom of Windria and the importance of world peace, insisting that Bloodhound had to be found. Brad ignored every word. He entered a hidden underworld guild without hesitation and demanded a job that would pay 500,000 gold before dawn. Then he threw his adventurer license onto the counter. The receptionist froze when she saw his class. SS rank mage, a license owned by only the top 1%. She quickly apologized for her earlier attitude and handed him a quest. It was an assassination request targeting the boss of an illegal gambling ring. The payment was enormous because the difficulty was extremely high. Brad was already too familiar with this kind of work. It disgusted him to the point of nausea. Still, he accepted the quest without hesitation. A few hours later, he returned to Brooke's residence and knocked harshly on the door, waking the half-asleep priest from his bed. Brooke woke up completely this time, fear washing over his face. Brad had brought the exact amount of money. 500,000 gold. But his clothes, his hands, even his face were stained with blood. His eyes were sharp and filled with anger. He said he was taking his daughter now. Dawn was approaching, and they had no more time. The two men walked toward a grave located farther back in the cemetery yard. Brooke began reciting verses from the holy book while Brad gripped a shovel tightly. Then he started digging up Fiat's grave. His daughter had died 1.5 years ago. Fiat and Lutz had been on their way to a carnival when a horse carriage struck them. The driver fled the scene. Fiat died instantly. Lutz survived, but only barely, left in the fragile condition she remained in now. After that tragedy, Brad withdrew from the front lines. The organization refused to accept his resignation. In the end, he chose to disappear on his own terms, becoming a shadow of his former self. He paused in his digging and stared at the coffin for a long moment. Quietly, he apologized to his daughter. They had to move cities again. He promised to take her with him. He prepared to return. Then his eyes widened in horror. In the distance, thick smoke and massive flames were rising from the direction of the abandoned hotel where he had been staying. The building was already burning fiercely. Citizens gathered outside, panicking and shouting in fear. Brad immediately cast fire resistance magic over himself and ran straight into the inferno. He forced his way up to the second floor. As he passed Fiat's room, he saw the furniture already consumed by flames. The dolls, the drawings, the family photos were slowly turning into ash. His heart pounded painfully as he watched those precious memories burn away. When he entered Lux's room, his body went still. On the bed lay a burned figure. The shape was so badly charred that it could no longer be recognized. Brad almost dropped to his knees, his entire body trembling uncontrollably. He crawled closer, reaching out toward the unrecognizable form, but the flames were too intense. Before his eyes, the fire reduced what remained of Lutz into drifting ash. He gathered the ashes into his arms and let out a broken scream. His cries were filled with unbearable grief. The air was thick with the smell of burning and old wood. In that moment, his heart shattered completely. Then he felt something. A faint trace of magic lingered in the air, carefully concealed but still present. There had been a third-party dot. Lutz had not died by accident. She had been burned to death by someone's magic. His tears evaporated in the heat around him. His voice turned hoarse as he swore that he would follow Lutz someday. Then he bit down hard on his lip, consumed by overwhelming rage. His eyes burned hotter than the surrounding flames, fueled by vengeance and a hatred that would never fade. The next morning, the fire had died down, leaving behind blackened ruins and the heavy smell of ash, and the nearby residents gathered around the site after hearing that someone had died in the blaze, offering small sympathy by placing flowers near. Quietly disappointed that despite the loss of life, the organization had already closed the investigation as an unknown accident. Convinced that the military police simply did not care enough to properly investigate something that happened in a slum district like that. While elsewhere, Brad was preparing himself in silence, shaving off his messy beard without concern for the fact that workers were already lining up at their workplace, cutting his hair short as if shedding an old skin. And Jammerberry, noticing Brad was not among the workers that morning, found himself drifting into thought, realizing that even after knowing him for a year, he had never truly understood what kind of life his co-worker had been living all this time. Meanwhile, the Bloodhound had already changed back into the clothes from his past, allowing bitter memories to wrap around him like armor. And that night, during a raging storm, he made his way toward the headquarters tower of the organization, burning the guards at the front gate with fire magic, before stepping inside and walking down each corridor with steady, merciless strides, eliminating anyone who stood in his path in the same ruthless manner, as if every step was repayment for the pain Lutz had suffered. When he reached the area near the main hall, someone was already waiting for him. Fine standing there to confront the Bloodhound and demanding to know why he had attacked the organization's headquarters after disappearing without a trace for so long. But Brad immediately turned the accusation back on him, because he knew exactly what had been done to his wife. The use of magic enhancement stones, standard equipment often used by the organization since they left almost no evidence behind, tools that Brad had always despised, and Fane tried to deflect, claiming that he and Lily had always needed Brad and would never have done such a thing, insisting that Brad was their guardian of peace. Yet Brad cut through that excuse with cold hatred, rejecting the title and declaring that in truth, he was nothing more than a murderer, while Fine casually argued that everything had been done in the name of justice and could not understand why Brad refused to see it that way. Brad's eyes narrowed as he asked in a chilling tone whether killing his wife counted as an act of justice. And at that moment, Fane's mask slipped, revealing a wide and twisted smile as he openly admitted it, explaining that to them, Lux had been an obstacle, that the Bloodhound was the strongest mage in the kingdom of Windria, and his power should have been devoted to world peace, that Lux had only limited him, and now the organization had set him free. Words that filled Brad with such disgust that he felt killing Fiend would not even be enough if he continued speaking. Fiend then unleashed magic from both hands, forming a phantom prison as layers of shadowy threads wrapped tightly around Brad's body, laughing as he declared his intention to make the Bloodhound sink into illusion forever. Yet the spell shattered before it could fully bind him, breaking apart as if it had struck something unmovable, and Fiend stared in shock because his illusion magic had never been broken before, panic rising as he prepared another attack. But Brad calmly whispered a rough incantation, Demon Touch Blade. In an instant, both of Fiend's wrists separated cleanly from his arms, as though sliced by an invisible edge, and he screamed in agony and terror, collapsing to the floor while begging desperately for his life. Yet Brad did not hesitate as he clenched his fist and ignited black flame magic around it, driving his burning punch straight into Fiend's stomach so that the dark fire devoured him from within. Fiend's screams growing louder as the black flames flared violently like they had been fed with fuel, leaving him writhing and dying, yet still weakly asking how his illusion magic could have been destroyed so easily. And Brad answered with detached indifference that illusion magic governs the heart. But his heart had long since died, and therefore could never be influenced by such spells, because it was the organization itself that had killed his heart long ago. And after leaving Fiend behind to burn, Brad moved onward, climbing toward Lily's room. The man stopped in front of a massive door engraved with the symbol of the organization, and now only Lily remained as his enemy. The final one, standing between him and his reunion with his wife, made his blood burn with impatience as Brad destroyed the door with brute force, shattering it using magic, before stepping into a vast and eerily empty room, where no furniture remained, except a single desk and an unused chair, making him briefly suspect that Lily had fled earlier. Yet he could sense a faint presence behind the desk and moved closer to confirm it, only for what he saw to completely stun him. A small girl wrapped in oversized adult clothes that were clearly Lily's, the two of them locking eyes as the child tilted her head in confusion and shock, and Brad immediately recognized the magical aura without doubt that this was Lily herself, leading him to believe she had deliberately reversed her age using magic down to that of a child, like Fiat's, so that he would hesitate to kill her, a thought that only fueled his rage further as he summoned Black Flame, ready to execute Lily for going this far just to twist his heart. However, just as his fist was about to strike, the child burst into loud, terrified sobs, causing Brad to cancel his magic mid-motion and freeze in confusion as Lily cried again, saying she was scared because he looked angry and that she did not know where she was or what was happening, then uttered nonsensical pleas like begging him not to eat her, her innocence painfully obvious, leaving Brad deeply unsettled as he struggled to determine whether Lily was acting or had truly lost her memories, knowing that ancient magic such as rejuvenation always demanded a price, and wondering if memory loss was that cost. And if so, then killing her now would mean nothing, because the one before him was merely a clueless child, and his revenge would never be fulfilled that way. Even so, he desperately wanted Lily to confess her sins and beg for mercy, because without that Lux's soul would never rest. And after a long moment of hesitation and inner conflict, Brad let out a heavy breath, reached for the child whose crying had begun to subside, and effortlessly lifted her up like an abandoned puppy being taken away, deciding to search for a skilled magic appraiser to determine whether Lily's amnesia was real or fabricated. Yet, just as he turned to leave the room, a bladed boomerang was hurled toward him, which he dodged easily by lowering his head as the weapon returned to its owner, and a woman called out his codename, prompting him to glance over and recognize Mumu, a woman he knew well from his days in the organization, who demanded that he release Lily and questioned why he had betrayed them. And as Brad noticed a glowing teleportation portal forming beneath Mumu's feet, he coldly replied that there was no point explaining anything to someone already brainwashed by ideology. Mumu frowned and honestly admitted her disappointment in her former master, and Brad, knowing from his investigation that she had not been involved in Lutz's murder, told her not to interfere with his revenge before smashing the window in front of him with a punch to create an escape route, then leapt out while carrying Lily as she screamed in fear and shock, leaving Mumu behind still trying to understand what he meant by revenge. But it was already too late as the bloodhound vanished from the tower, abandoning his former student, who could only stare at his retreating back with a bitter and confused expression. After that, Brad headed to the home of an old acquaintance named Kabu, a magic technician known for studying strange spells and magical phenomena. The moment Brad stepped inside carrying a small child in his arms, Kabu froze in shock. His loud reaction immediately frightened Lily, whose small body trembled nervously under the sudden noise. Ignoring the confusion, Brad bluntly asked Kabu to analyze the magical effect currently affecting the girl. Even after agreeing, Kabu still struggled to understand the situation. He originally intended to calm Lily down by finding some cake for her. But Brad suddenly revealed the truth. The child standing before them was supposedly the ruthless leader of the criminal organization feared across the kingdom. Kabu snapped his head toward Lily in disbelief, his voice rising once again in shock. It made no sense to him. The infamous leader, known for possessing an unbreakable iron will, had somehow become a helpless little girl. Brad briefly explained everything that had happened, though Kabu quickly grew irritated after hearing this story. He scolded Brad for recklessly handling such a dangerous situation alone, despite repeated warnings. Even the king and powerful nobles avoided provoking that organization. If Brad had made one wrong move against their leader, he could have easily lost his life. Brad only snorted dismissively before stating his theory that Lily had used rejuvenation magic. That was precisely why he needed Kabu's expertise. After taking a long breath to calm himself, Kabu finally turned serious. Looking directly at Lily, Kabu admitted there was a strong possibility that ancient rejuvenation magic had indeed been used on her. Brad then added another request. He wanted Kabu to examine Lily's memories and mental condition as well. Kabu walked toward a large covered machine and explained that rejuvenation magic was an ancient forbidden spell that should have vanished thousands of years ago. Once the cloth covering the device was removed, a terrifying machine came into view. It was a massive structure filled with pipes, strange coils, and a chair placed at the center, resembling some grotesque creation pulled from a mad scientist's laboratory. Smoke hissed from the machine, while eerie sounds echoed through the room, instantly terrifying Lily. She screamed and tried to run away. Brad immediately grabbed the back of her clothes and pulled her back roughly. Without hesitation, he carried her by force and tried to place her onto the chair. Kabu let out a small, awkward laugh at the sight before him. Lily looked exactly like a child, throwing a tantrum at her father. For a brief moment, Brad froze. The image reminded him of his own daughter, Fiat's, whose smiling face and occasional whining still lingered painfully in his memories. Realizing he had spoken carelessly, Kabu quickly apologized, but Brad simply rubbed his face roughly and remained silent. Not long after, Brad coldly ordered Lily to sit on the machine. He yanked the edge of her clothing harshly and threw her into the chair before glaring down at her with murderous eyes. If she resisted, he would kill her without hesitation. Brad then ordered Kabu to begin the examination immediately. This time, Kabu approached Lily more gently, trying to calm her fears so she would stop struggling. He carefully attached restraint cuffs around her wrists and ankles before activating several switches on the machine. Finally, he pulled a large lever. The machine roared violently as magical energy surged throughout the room. Strange sounds echoed from within the device while the analysis began. After several tense moments, a long strip of paper slowly emerged from the machine. Kabu eagerly read through the results, but his expression quickly shifted into shock. Muttering under his breath, he confirmed that Lily had truly been rejuvenated by ancient magic. Brad immediately demanded answers about her memories. Lily no longer possessed any memories from her adult life. The side effects of the forbidden magic had sealed away nearly everything. The only things left behind were basic language abilities and simple everyday habits. She could not even remember her own name. Climbing down from the chair, Lily innocently explained that she only knew her name because Brad had called her that earlier. When Kabu gently asked about her parents, where she was born, or where she used to live, Lily could not answer a single question. With a heavy sigh, Kabu finally concluded that the feared leader of the organization was now nothing more than an innocent 4-year-old child. Brad's anger exploded instantly, furious that all his efforts had become meaningless. He grabbed Lily's shoulders violently and demanded she confess her sins after making him and his family suffer for so long. Kabu immediately pulled Brad away and forced him to calm down before things escalated further. After regaining some control over himself, Brad asked if there was any possible way to restore Lily's memories. Unfortunately, Kabu admitted there was little he could do unless they found a specialist in ancient magic. Then suddenly, Kabu remembered something. He hurried toward a bookshelf and searched through several old records before pulling out a thick book containing a list of magic researchers registered under the Royal Academy. Flipping through the pages, he eventually stopped at one particular entry featuring a photograph of Professor Nimugen. According to the records, the professor was the founder of ancient magic research and currently lived in a remote place called Olford Village. After hearing that, Brad decided to leave for the village himself, entrusting Lily to Kabu while he searched for answers. Kabu immediately rejected the idea. It was only a matter of time before members of the organization came searching for Lily. The safest option was obvious. Brad needed to take Lily with him. The two men continued arguing back and forth until Kabu finally snapped and shouted at the top of his lungs. Yet, before continuing, he suddenly fell silent. His eyes shifted toward Lily, who stood nearby staring at them with confusion written across her small face. Kabu dragged Brad into another room and reminded him that Lily was nothing more than an ordinary child now. There was no reason to treat her so harshly, especially when Brad kept demanding confessions for sins the girl herself could not even remember. Hearing those words, Brad finally released a long, exhausted sigh. His anger had calmed enough for him to think clearly again. Reluctantly, he agreed to bring Lily along on the journey. Before they left, Kabu modified some clothes so Lily could wear them properly. The little girl now looked strangely adorable in her adjusted outfit. Kabu reminded Brad to buy proper clothes for her later and urged them to leave the city as quickly as possible. Brad clicked his tongue irritably, but there was still one final thing he needed to do before departing. He returned to the mansion, belonging to the priest who guarded the graves of his wife and child. The moment the door opened, Priest Drock already looked furious as usual. But before the man could even speak, Brad slammed Drock's head violently against the wall. All the frustration Brad had buried for so long exploded at once. If Drock had not demanded such insane amounts of money in the past, Lux might still be alive now. Drock screamed in pain, but Brad showed no mercy. He refused to let a priest like Drock continue watching over the graves of his wife and daughter. Brad ordered Drock to swear before God that he would relinquish his status as a priest and leave the island forever. Drock stared at him in shock. Such a thing was nearly impossible for him. Brad did not care. With terrifying ease, he snapped one of Drock's fingers, causing the priest to shriek in agony. Brad coldly continued his demands, ordering Drock to appoint someone truly worthy to replace him. Drock desperately claimed he lacked the authority to make such a decision. The excuse only earned him another broken finger. For the final time, Brad warned him not to refuse again. If Drock lied or failed to keep his promise, Brad would personally kill him without hesitation. From outside the doorway, Lily quietly peeked into the room before innocently asking whether the priest was a bad person. The little girl admitted she probably disliked bad people too. Brad looked genuinely startled for a moment and quickly asked whether she remembered anything related to that feeling. Unfortunately, Lily still remembered nothing. Brad sighed in disappointment once more before deciding to leave. As they walked away, Lily cheerfully continued talking beside him. If Drock really was a bad person, then defeating bad people meant Brad himself must be a good person too. Brad neither responded nor looked back at her. He simply ordered Lily to stay quiet. Still, the little girl happily skipped behind him, curiously saying she wanted to learn more about him. The two eventually traveled together on a crowded horse carriage alongside several other passengers. Lily stared outside with endless excitement, admiring every passing view with sparkling eyes. Her innocent enthusiasm amused the passengers around them. One of the passengers casually commented that Lily was very lively and that the two of them looked like a close father and daughter pair. The moment those words were spoken, Brad shot the man a terrifying glare. The entire carriage instantly fell silent under the suffocating tension. Everyone awkwardly avoided eye contact afterward. Brad rubbed his forehead in annoyance. Of course, ordinary people would assume they were family. After 10 exhausting days of travel, they finally arrived at Olford village. Vast fields of green grass stretched endlessly beneath the open sky. Lily, who had been sleepy moments earlier, immediately lit up with excitement after spotting groups of fat sheep wandering through the fields. Brad originally intended to head straight toward Professor Nemugen, but then he noticed Lily still was not wearing proper shoes. If he continued dragging around a barefoot child, people would eventually grow suspicious and unnecessary trouble could follow. In the end, he reluctantly stopped by the nearest general store he could find. Inside, the shop was filled with everyday supplies and neatly arranged clothing. A middle-aged woman soon appeared after hearing the door open. She welcomed them warmly, before immediately complimenting Brad, calling him a handsome young father. Brad placed an order for 2 sets of travel supplies, along with several children's clothes. The shopkeeper crouched down beside Lily and laughed warmly, commenting that wearing her father's oversized clothes must have been difficult for such a tiny girl. The unfamiliar word of father immediately caught Lily's attention. Her eyes sparkled brightly as she repeated it out loud. The single word pierced straight through Brad's chest. For a brief moment, memories of Fiat's flooded his mind again. He could almost see his daughter running toward him with a smile, calling him by that same name. The trauma twisted his senses so badly that he nearly hallucinated the scene entirely. He only snapped back to reality after the shopkeeper called him several times in confusion. This time, he managed to put on a stiff, fake smile while asking the woman for sturdy outdoor clothes suitable for travel. If possible, he even wanted leather armor for Lily. The shopkeeper burst into laughter at the ridiculous request. There was no such thing as armor designed for children. Still, Brad stubbornly insisted on trying the smallest set available in the store. But even the chest piece alone looked absurdly oversized on Lily, hanging heavily over her tiny body while making it difficult for her to move properly. Brad awkwardly frowned at the sight. The image he had imagined in his head looked completely different from reality. The middle-aged woman chuckled softly, guessing Brad must have been the type of father who left all matters regarding clothing and childcare to his wife. The casual remark struck him harder than expected, because it was completely true. He had always been terrified of accidentally hurting Fiats, so Lutz ended up handling nearly all the parenting responsibilities herself. The regret buried inside him deepened once again, because of his own failures. Both Lutz and Fiats had suffered before eventually dying. Annoyed by the emotion surfacing in his chest, Brad finally gave up and left all of Lily's supplies entirely to the shopkeeper. 10 minutes later, Lily had been completely transformed into an adorable little girl, no different from any ordinary child. She now wore proper clothes, shoes that actually fit her, and a small travel bag suited for her size. Brad barely cared about her appearance and immediately paid for everything without comment. After leaving the store, he roughly stuffed several travel supplies into Lily's bag before handing it over to her. From now on, she would have to take care of herself. At first, Lily did not even realize the bag was meant for her. She stared at it in confusion before suddenly hugging it tightly against her chest, as if she had received a precious gift. Brad quickly brushed the idea aside, telling her it only contained daily necessities and nothing more. Lily did not care. To her, it was still something special. The little girl happily spun around Brad while humming and dancing excitedly beside him. Too lazy to deal with her further, Brad harshly ordered her to stop fooling around and head toward Professor Nemugen's residence immediately. Deep down, he truly could not understand why Lily looked so happy over something meaningless like shopping. The only reason they had come to this village was because of his revenge. Eventually, the two arrived at another vast grassy field. In the distance stood a large ancient building resembling half of a crumbling castle. As they approached the entrance, Brad could hear loud complaints echoing from inside. The voice continuously shouted about the enormous laboratory, piles of random junk, dusty old shelves, and the misery of cleaning the entire place every single day. From the sound of it, Brad guessed the speaker was someone young. After all, Professor Nemugen himself should have been extremely old by now. Brad grabbed the door handle and knocked several times. Instantly, the complaining stopped. Only silence remained. Confused, Brad knocked harder and louder. Eventually, the young male voice returned, angrily yelling for him to go away while refusing to open the door. Brad calmly replied that he needed to meet Professor Nemugen. In response, the boy bitterly questioned why anyone would still want to meet the professor in his current state. A moment later, the door suddenly swung open. A young boy appeared with smoke practically rising from his head out of frustration. Without hesitation, he tried to attack Brad immediately. However, the bloodhound merely whispered a wind incantation under his breath. A violent gust instantly burst from behind him, creating a powerful spiral of air. Brad intentionally held back, so the magic did not seriously injure the boy. But the impact was still enough to send him tumbling painfully across the floor several times. The boy stared in shock. Unlike previous visitors, this man had used magic instantly. Brad calmly introduced himself, while Lily suddenly jumped forward excitedly to introduce herself as well. Seeing the tiny child beside him, the boy quickly realized Brad was not connected to the Royal Academy. Embarrassed, he rubbed the back of his head awkwardly, realizing how ridiculous he must have looked moments earlier. Brad approached him and casually advised him to confirm his opponent properly before attacking next time. Then he extended a hand to help him stand. The boy accepted it gratefully while introducing himself as Raven. Officially, he worked there as an assistant, though lately he felt more like a caretaker than anything else. When Brad asked where Professor Nemugen was, Raven's expression immediately darkened. Even so, he quietly invited the two guests to follow him deeper inside the building. They passed through a massive circular hall, unlike anything Brad and Lily had ever seen before. Strange magical devices, bizarre artifacts, and unfamiliar tools filled every corner of the enormous laboratory. Lily could not hold back her amazement. Brad quickly scolded her for acting recklessly. Their argument ended the moment Raven called for Brad to enter another room. Raven's face looked unusually gloomy as he warned Brad not to become too disappointed. The door slowly opened. Inside was a completely different world. The ceiling above had been left open, allowing warm sunlight to pour gently into a beautifully maintained garden. Hidden within the old structure, birds quietly rested near a stone grave positioned at the far end of the room. In front of the grave sat a lone chair bathed softly in sunlight. Brad slowly approached the figure seated there. There was no doubt this had to be Professor Nemugen. But the moment Brad saw him clearly, his steps halted. The old professor looked utterly hollow, his empty eyes staring far into nowhere. An open book rested on his lap, while his fingers remained motionless against its pages. Brad crouched in front of the old man, quietly studying his face for a long moment. Beside him, Lily tilted her head in confusion, unsure what was happening. With a tired sigh, Raven finally stepped forward and explained everything. The last time Professor Nemugen had been able to hold a proper conversation was over a year ago. 2 years earlier, the professor's wife had died during a deadly plague outbreak. Since that day, he had completely changed. Every day was spent silently wandering through the garden his wife once loved. His room remained untouched, filled with the belongings she had left behind. Brad asked if Raven had really been taking care of him alone all this time. The boy explained that he still needed a recommendation letter from the professor before he could leave for another job. On top of that, people from the academy constantly came to pressure them into shutting down the laboratory. Brad gave a faint smile. It meant Raven had been protecting both the professor and the lab by himself. Embarrassed and irritated, the boy immediately denied it. Raven then asked if Brad could use magic to help the professor somehow. Brad admitted he had considered one method, but he could never recommend it. Using illusion magic, recreate the image of the professor's late wife, and perhaps shock him back to his senses. Raven was horrified by the idea and rejected it immediately. Even Brad himself thought it was cruel. There was another option involving mental magic and entering the professor's mind directly, but with Nemugen's fragile mental state, the risk was far too high. In the end, Brad apologized for being unable to help and decided to leave. Before going, he asked Raven if there was an inn nearby. Since there was only one in the village and Raven was already heading toward the market, the boy guided them there. During the walk, Raven casually explained that he was also responsible for preparing the professor's meals and handling most of the daily chores. Lily responded with sympathy, realizing how busy he must be every day. But Raven simply kicked a stone along the road and muttered that staying busy suited him better anyway. Lily became fascinated by the stone he kicked and tried doing the same herself. But her short legs failed miserably, causing her to trip and fall. As they continued walking, Brad asked what kind of person Professor Nemugen used to be. Raven answered that the old man had an incredibly sharp tongue. Brad quietly remarked that Raven's personality might actually resemble the professor's more than he realized. completely ignoring Lily still recovering from her fall. Eventually, they arrived at the marketplace. Dozens of small vendors lined the area, creating the lively atmosphere of a typical market, though far simpler than those in larger towns for Lily, who had never seen anything like it before. The pain from falling vanished instantly as she stared around in amazement. The market buzzed with customers shopping and merchants loudly advertising their goods. The smell of freshly cooked food drifted through the air, making the place feel even more alive. In the village, the market only operated for 3 hours every evening, so everyone rushed to buy what they needed before time ran out. It was also more efficient for the merchants, which was why the villagers supported the system. Apparently, the entire arrangement had originally been designed by Professor Nimugun himself. Raven stopped beside one of the vendors and pointed Brad toward the inn before parting ways with them. However, only moments later, Brad heard Raven shouting angrily at someone nearby. The instant Lily recognized his voice, she tugged on Brad's sleeve and pulled him back to investigate. By the time they turned around, Raven had already stormed away from the stall while furiously yelling curses behind him. Brad approached the shopkeeper Raven had argued with and introduced himself as a traveler visiting the ancient magic laboratory. Meanwhile, Lily became distracted by rows of fresh fish displayed nearby, only for Brad to quickly warn her not to touch them. When he asked about the argument, the vendor explained that before Professor Nimugin took him in, Raven had been a thief, so the misunderstanding had happened by accident. Raven was an orphan who had escaped from a brigade before eventually settling in the village. At heart, he had always been a troublesome child, though fortunately the professor adopted him before he could be sent away to an orphanage. After hearing the story, Brad forcefully picked Lily up and continued toward the inn. Deep down, he had already started thinking that the only place capable of helping with Lily's condition now was the Royal Academy, even if Raven despised the people there more than anything, since Academy officials appeared in the village every single day. Brad assumed they had to be staying somewhere nearby. Whether they had uncovered anything about ancient magic was uncertain. The moment he entered the inn, the receptionist welcomed him and asked him to sign both his and Lily's names into the guest book. While writing, Brad casually asked whether any staff from the Royal Academy were staying there as well. Just as he expected, they had been occupying the inn for nearly 20 days already. Every evening, they sat complaining endlessly in the corner of the building, unable to return home until their mission was complete. After securing the information he wanted, Brad also ordered dinner to be delivered to the room. When the receptionist asked how many portions he needed, he answered in a rough, emotionless voice, saying that only the little girl accompanying him would be eating. Not long after, the meal arrived. A steaming hamburger steak and warm soup immediately made Lily's stomach rumble with hunger. She eagerly tasted both dishes, while Brad remained near the window, silently staring outside. After a while, Lily timidly asked why Brad never ate together with her during mealtime. The man refused to answer and did not even look in her direction. Nervously fidgeting, Lily eventually picked up her plate and carefully approached him. She offered him the food, hoping to convince him to eat with her, but Brad coldly snapped at her and ordered her to finish her own meal instead. Lily did not look surprised by the rejection, yet sadness still crept across her face. Quietly, she returned to the table and continued eating alone. Meanwhile, Brad only grew more irritated with himself. The entire scene made him feel like an adult bullying a helpless child. Frustrated, he violently shut the curtains and said that he would gather information downstairs, warning Lily not to leave the room. He repeatedly forced himself to remember the truth. Lily was the monster responsible for Lux and Fiat's deaths. No matter how harmless she appeared, he had to keep hating her. Downstairs, the inn had become crowded with people drinking and talking loudly. Brad scanned the room and quickly spotted his targets sitting in the corner. One was a prideful-looking woman named Ariana, while the other was a short man with a short beard named Nemo. Brad approached them directly and confirmed whether they were staff members from the Royal Academy. Both looked at him with immediate annoyance before asking what business he had with them. Ignoring their attitude, Brad asked whether they knew anything about ancient magic. The question instantly changed the atmosphere. For a brief second, both Academy members fell silent. Then, Ariana suddenly burst into laughter, mocking Brad as if he were insane. If they truly knew anything about ancient magic, they would not still be trapped in a miserable village after wasting weeks there. Nemo scolded Ariana for her behavior before guessing that Brad must have already met Professor Nemugen. With an amused snort, he remarked that the professor was practically as good as dead already. Ariana laughed again, joining Nemo openly this time. Realizing the conversation would lead nowhere useful, Brad turned and prepared to leave. Before he could walk away, however, Nemo called out that if the Academy eventually managed to obtain the laboratory, they might be willing to help Brad in the future. Of course, such help would come at a very expensive price. Brad questioned whether the professor had not refused to surrender the laboratory. Nemo responded with a sly smile, claiming situations could change at any moment. After all, the Academy possessed powerful backing behind the scenes. Brad returned upstairs, carrying an unpleasant feeling in his chest. But the moment he opened the room door, that irritation exploded into something even worse. Lily was gone. The window he had shut earlier now hung open, revealing exactly how she had escaped. The little girl had returned to the marketplace. She was being struck violently across the face, her tiny body tumbling across the dirt several times. A furious vendor was beating her after catching her stealing bread. Even while crying, Lily desperately hugged the loaf against her chest and stubbornly refused to return it. The shopkeeper only grew angrier, ignoring the people around him trying to calm him down. He clenched his fist again, preparing to hit her once more. Before the punch could land, Brad quietly whispered a small wind spell. A sudden gust knocked the man off balance, leaving the surrounding crowd confused about what had happened. Forced to intervene, Brad apologized and claimed that Lily was his daughter, before paying an absurdly excessive amount for the bread. The vendor greedily snatched the money away while angrily insulting Brad for raising such a poorly behaved child. Meanwhile, Lily stared at the ruined bread in her arms. Large tears slowly filled her eyes before she suddenly broke down sobbing. Still crying loudly, she followed Brad all the way back toward the inn. Brad could not understand why she was crying so hard over nothing more than flattened bread. Through broken sobs, Lily finally admitted that she had stolen it for a reason. She stretched the damaged loaf toward Brad, who stood before her with folded arms and visible irritation. The bread had been meant for him. Because Brad never ate anything, Lily thought that bringing him food that looked delicious might make him happy. Before she could finish explaining herself, another wave of tears overwhelmed her. Brad stood frozen with his mouth slightly open, unable to say a single word. He felt genuinely confused. He could not understand why this strange little girl cared so much about him at all. Brad immediately lectured Lily, warning her never to do something like that again. Stealing was wrong, no matter the reason. To his surprise, Lily did not even understand the meaning of stealing in the first place. She also had no idea what money was supposed to be. Brad clicked his tongue in annoyance as realization slowly hit him. Lily had been raised inside an organization since childhood. There was a good chance she had never learned something as ordinary as buying things from a store. Before the conversation could continue, both of them suddenly heard furious shouting downstairs. The voice sounded unmistakably like Raven's. When Brad came down, he found the boy aggressively demanding Brad's room number from the receptionist, despite being refused repeatedly. The moment Raven spotted him, he rushed forward in panic and begged for help. His face had gone pale from fear. Something terrible had happened to Professor Nemugen. The three of them hurried back toward the laboratory. Even from a distance, the building looked wrong. A strange dark presence surrounded it. Flickering like twisted flames, Lily nervously grabbed onto Brad's clothes, saying the sight felt disgusting and frightening. Brad immediately recognized it as magic, but it could not have been Raven's doing. The boy possessed no detectable magical presence whatsoever. Meanwhile, Lily excitedly asked whether Brad was going to save both Raven and Professor Nemugen. Deep inside, Brad denied it completely. He had no intention of helping anyone. The only thing he needed was the professor himself. As they stepped into the central garden, the sky overhead had turned unnaturally black, only to discover something completely unexpected. Professor Nemugen looked perfectly healthy. He was smiling, laughing, and talking happily, as if the miserable shell from yesterday had never existed. Strange magical smoke connected itself to the gravestone of his late wife, while the professor cheerfully spoke beside it, almost as though he could truly hear Marjorie answering him. Lily stared in confusion and innocently wondered if the professor was talking to a ghost. It was the exact illusion magic they had rejected before. For a brief moment, an unwanted thought crossed his mind. If he used those magic for himself, then perhaps his own wife and child could remain beside him forever too. At that moment, Professor Nimogen finally noticed Brad's presence and instantly ordered Raven to throw him out. Just as Raven had described, the professor's tongue was brutally sharp. Still, because he was apparently in a good mood, he agreed to at least hear what Brad wanted. With an unusually gentle smile, Nimogen turned toward the illusion of his wife and softly remarked that Marjorie had always been a far kinder person than he was. The emotion in his eyes struck Brad harder than expected. He understood that expression perfectly because he had once worn it himself. To clear his head, Brad punched his own chest lightly before asking Raven to step outside for a moment. In the main hall, they discussed who could possibly benefit from using such cruel magic on the professor. Technically, Brad himself would gain something from it. Yet Raven never once suspected him. After all, the incident had occurred around 6 in the evening, exactly when Brad and Lily had been in the marketplace dealing with Lily's commotion. Raven thought carefully, concluding that the academy staff seemed unlikely suspects since they appeared more entertained by the professor slowly dying than recovering. Brad silently disagreed with that assumption. The higher a person's authority, the more casually they tended to cheat behind the scenes. Still, the true objective remained unclear. He suddenly remembered Nemo's earlier words and the confidence hidden behind them, as though the academy already believed victory was within reach. Raven rubbed his head in frustration. He had wanted the professor to recover for a long time, but never like this. While the two continued speaking, Professor Nimogen noticed Raven staring at him with tearful eyes. Misunderstanding the situation completely, the old man hurried out from the garden. Assuming Brad had said something cruel to the boy, Nimogen even shouted for his wife to follow behind him. Brad immediately clicked his tongue in irritation. If the professor's emotions became unstable, the illusion magic would likely collapse. Exactly as he feared, the illusion began to fade before the professor's eyes. Marjorie's form slowly dissolved into smoke. Professor Nimogen panicked instantly, desperately screaming her name over and over. Raven could not bear watching the scene any longer and quietly began sobbing. Meanwhile, the professor dropped to his knees, tears pouring endlessly down his face as the illusion disappeared completely. For several moments, he remained kneeling at the garden entrance, consumed by unbearable grief. Raven cautiously approached, trying to comfort him, but Nimogen violently slapped his hand away. The professor suddenly accused Brad, believing he had been responsible for the illusion magic all along. Brad attempted to deny it, yet Nimogen refused to listen and screamed at him to stay silent. Sensing danger immediately, Brad ordered Raven and Lily to get behind him. The professor pulled a magic wand from his pocket and cast a spell called Spiral Dust. Light erupted from the wand's tip before shooting upward into the laboratory ceiling. Instantly, countless objects throughout the building began floating wildly through the air. Without hesitation, Nimogen launched every single one toward Brad at terrifying speed. Brad shouted a defensive spell in response. However, this was no ordinary defense magic. A massive magical barrier materialized before them, so enormous that Raven's eyes widened in shock. Every projectile crashed harmlessly against the shield, prevented from bouncing back toward the professor himself. Furious, Nimogen repeatedly attacked again and again, but eventually exhaustion overtook him. The old man finally collapsed into a seated position, breathing heavily. Brad quickly dismissed the barrier. Before slowly walking toward the broken professor, gently, he took the wand from Nimogen's trembling hands. Raven immediately explained once more that Brad had nothing to do with the illusion spell. Nimogen merely muttered weakly that he did not care anymore. Nothing mattered if Marjorie was no longer beside him. Slowly, Professor Nimogen's awareness began fading once again. The life returned to his eyes only moments earlier, now disappeared completely. Raven desperately tried to call him back to reality, but it was already too late. Right then, the laboratory doors were violently kicked open. 3 men stormed inside and immediately identified themselves as military police. Without hesitation, they announced Raven's arrest on charges of illegal illusion magic usage and extorting Professor Nimogen. The accusations were so sudden and absurd that Raven could only stare at them in complete shock, unable to understand what was happening. That night at the inn, Lily constantly asked Brad about Raven's situation, but the man only told her to sleep instead of worrying about other people. Lily protested, asking why they were not helping Raven and insisting the professor would be lonely all by himself. Brad coldly answered that they had no reason to interfere in someone else's problems. Hearing that made Lily furious. She stomped her feet in frustration until Brad finally grabbed her, carried her over his shoulder, and tossed her onto the bed in annoyance. Even then, Lily stubbornly refused to sleep unless Brad agreed to help Raven. Exhausted, Brad finally sighed and offered a condition. If Lily got into bed, closed her eyes, and counted 100 sheep, then he would help Raven afterward. Lily immediately agreed with sparkling determination. However, after barely counting 2 sheep, she fell completely asleep. Brad released a tired sigh while staring at the sleeping girl. The Valburga, he knew, was a woman capable of calmly ordering massacres without hesitation. Yet seeing Lily now, small and innocent beneath the blankets, made him briefly wonder if she had originally been a kind girl before something twisted her into a monster later in life. He quickly forced the thought away. It did not matter. By morning, Lily would probably forget all about her request anyway. Unfortunately, the next morning, Lily's tantrum became even worse than before. She refused to eat breakfast unless Brad helped Raven. Her stubbornness escalated further when she refused to wash her face or change clothes, and she even threatened to wet herself on purpose if necessary. Completely defeated by her relentless persistence, Brad finally gave in and agreed to visit the laboratory. Though he firmly insisted they were only going there to observe the situation, Lily instantly grinned in triumph, delighted that she had successfully convinced Brad to help both Raven and Professor DEMI-GOD. When they arrived at the laboratory, they found several wagons parked outside, along with a group of academy staff carrying boxes of equipment out from the building. Among them stood Nemo and Ariana. The moment Lily saw them, she ran forward and loudly accused them of stealing the professor's belongings. Nemo calmly explained that, with Raven already arrested, the laboratory now required new management. Since the military police had officially entrusted the academy with the responsibility, ownership of the laboratory effectively belonged to them now. He casually added that Raven had already been declared a criminal for blackmailing Professor DEMI-GOD into writing a recommendation letter for future employment. According to him, all the evidence had already been confiscated. Beside him, Ariana pretended to act morally outraged, claiming it was unforgivable to manipulate such a helpless old man. Brad knew the academy had been secretly monitoring Raven all along and had fabricated evidence to trap him. He then asked who would care for Professor DEMI-GOD now. Nemo answered with visible disgust that the old man would simply be transferred into some kind of facility, since nobody wanted to deal with someone so useless anymore. Smirking cruelly, Nemo mentioned that DEMI-GOD was currently sitting in the central garden, even mocking Brad by suggesting he could volunteer to change the professor's diapers himself. Ignoring the provocation entirely, Brad simply picked Lily up and walked straight toward the garden. There, Professor DEMI-GOD sat silently in a wheelchair beneath the dark sky, his eyes empty and lifeless. He looked completely powerless. As Brad approached, he realized the old man had wet himself. In that instant, he knew how much Raven must have cared for the professor to continue looking after him every single day without complaint. Without saying a word, Brad quietly cast a cleaning spell. Brad told Lily to stay where she was. While he attempted to enter the professor's heart directly, Lily immediately became excited. Realizing that Brad had finally decided to help after all, he cast a mental invasion spell. His body slowly faded away like mist before disappearing completely. The moment Brad opened his eyes again, he found himself standing inside an endless world of darkness. The space was cold, silent, and impossibly vast. Tiny floating lights drifted through the void, which Brad assumed were fragments of the professor's memories. He instinctively tightened his jacket around himself as freezing air crawled across his skin. Even walking felt difficult there, as though despair itself weighed down every step. He knew he had to remain careful. If he stayed too long, he could easily be dragged into the professor's hopelessness as well. After wandering through the darkness for what felt like forever, Brad finally found DEMI-GOD. The old man sat cross-legged in the distance, his dim figure barely visible within the endless black space. Yet even inside his own heart, DEMI-GOD looked exactly the same as his physical body, empty, exhausted, broken. Brad immediately began speaking, explaining that Raven was currently suffering because of the Academy's scheme. He told DEMI-GOD that the Academy staff had framed the boy and planned to seize control of the laboratory as well. Brad demanded to know whether none of that mattered to him anymore. Was there truly nothing left in his heart besides his dead wife? DEMI-GOD never answered. His silence itself felt heavier than words. Suddenly, Brad found himself mumbling things he never intended to say aloud. He could not stop it. He admitted that he understood the professor's pain. Losing someone precious hurt more than anything. Even as he spoke, memories of Lux and Fiat flooded violently back into his mind. His body trembled uncontrollably, and his strength vanished beneath him. Brad collapsed onto the cold darkness. Overwhelmed by pain, grief, and suffocating emptiness all at once, he immediately realized this was the limit. Another step deeper, and he would be swallowed entirely by the professor's despair. Brad forced himself to stand and began running away from Nemugen, desperately reminding himself of his true purpose. Revenge was all that mattered. Nothing else should concern him. Then, suddenly, a faint light flickered somewhere behind him. A gentle voice softly echoed through the darkness, praising Brad for always being kind and helping others. Brad froze instantly. His eyes widened as he turned around in shock. That voice belonged to Lux, but when he looked back, there was nothing there except the same endless darkness. Even so, hearing that voice snapped something awake inside him. It felt as though Lux herself had guided him back. Brad clenched his fists and ran toward Nemugen again. This time, he grabbed the old man's shoulders and shook him forcefully. Brad shouted that Nemugen was not truly alone. Raven was still waiting for him outside. The boy who had remained beside him through every miserable day was suffering now and needed to be saved. If Nemugen still wished to drown in grief until death eventually claimed him, then he was free to do so afterward. But first, he needed to repay the debt he owed Raven for never abandoning him. Still, there was no response. Brad waited several long moments before finally sighing in defeat. There truly seemed to be nothing more he could do. Then, unexpectedly, a miracle happened. Nemugen suddenly muttered that Brad was an unbearably noisy brat. Brad blinked in shock as the professor lazily ordered him to leave immediately. Confused by the sudden reaction, Brad could only stare while Nemugen smirked faintly. At that exact moment, the entire dark world around them suddenly burst into brilliant light. The professor explained that if Brad remained inside his mind any longer, then neither of them would ever regain consciousness properly again. Moments later, Brad finally returned to the laboratory garden. The exhaustion hit him instantly, forcing a heavy sigh from his chest. Lily, who had been impatiently waiting the entire time, immediately rushed over with excitement. However, even she became stunned when she noticed Professor Nemugen standing nearby on his own feet. Lily's eyes sparkled with overwhelming happiness. She jumped up enthusiastically, celebrating the fact that Nemugen was finally moving again. At last, their mission to save Raven was finally about to begin.